Right, good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's Simon Wiesenthal lecture, German as a Jewish Problem, the Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism by Marc Volovici. My name is Miriam Wilhelm. I'm a project collaborator here at the VWI, and it's my pleasure to be here tonight as the designated moderator. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few words about the technicalities of tonight's format. So, due to the pandemic, tonight's lecture will be in a hybrid format. So that means, in addition to our audience in the room, we also have online participants who are following the lecture via live stream on Zoom. And a special thanks to our technical support team for making all of this magic possible. Also, I would like to remind you that for your own safety and also the safety of our staff, to please make sure that you wear your mask at your seat and at any time during the lecture. Now, the lecture itself will be roughly about 50 minutes, followed by a 30 minutes discussion with our in-person audience. And now, without much further ado, I'm very happy to introduce tonight's speaker. Marc Volovici is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Birkbeck College's History Department and the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the University of London. He holds a PhD from Princeton University, and he's the author of this wonderful book that you can see here, German as a Jewish Problem, The Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism, which was published by Stanford University Press just last year. Marc has also served as an academic advisor, and he co-edited the exhibition catalogue for the award-winning exhibition Jews, Money, Myth, developed in collaboration with the Jewish Museum in London, which ran at the museum in 2019. Marc, many thanks for being with us tonight, and we're already very much looking forward to your lecture, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, so thank you, Miriam, for this introduction and the kind words. And thank you to Professor Eva Kovac for inviting me here to this institute, and to Greta for all the work that really made this event actually possible. And lastly, thank you to all of you coming here in the midst of a pandemic. It's not it is indeed essential that you all come here, and I appreciate that you made it, and to see this lively event after quite a long while when this was not really possible. It's very moving, and I really appreciate this. So it's quite fitting that I'm speaking today here in Vienna about this book and at the Simon Wiesenthal Institute for many reasons that don't really need to be elaborated. But maybe one reason can be a bit expanded on, and this is the fact that Simon Wiesenthal is, of course, known for his tremendous work as a Holocaust survivor and as a Nazi hunter who was based in Vienna after the war, having been born in Galicia and grew up in Poland, and later eventually becoming part of Austrian intellectual and political activities in different ways. And one of the things that really marked his activity and his personality was the fact that he was both an insider, an integral part of his city, but also a bit of an outsider. And that was partly reflected also in his quite distinct Yiddish accent, that even though he was a very prominent and quite elegant writer in the German language, his Yiddish was always there and kind of marking him and a bit setting him apart from the milieus in which he moved around. And in this context, it's quite fitting that his own definition of a refugee touched on this topic. So for him, a refugee is a person who has lost everything except his accent. That's what he said. And of course, it's half humorous, but only half humorous, because ultimately he did mean that there is something very profound and deep that the language and the way people use it basically carry for years, even after history changes and the atmospheres are different, but some kind of relic continues to shape individuals and societies and communities in ways that the language sort of reflects better than anything else. So, given all these connections, it might be useful. It might be useful to really start here talking about my book. So, German: The Jewish Problem, which basically is a book that tells the history of Jews in the modern period, European Jews mostly, and the formation of Jewish nationalism through the lens of language. The main protagonist of the book is the German language. Because since the 18th century, German has held a crucial and multifaceted place in the history of European Jews, serving as a catalyst of secularization, emancipation, and assimilation in various Jewish communities within and beyond German-speaking areas. In the eyes of both Jewish proponents and opponents of the Enlightenment, German had the capacity to radically transform the worldview of Jews and the outlook of Jewish society. Beginning in the late 19th century, the German language played a key, if loaded, role in Jewish nationalist politics, in particular in Zionism. German's status as a major language of Jewish culture and politics eroded gradually after the First World War and vanished in the wake of the Nazi period and the Holocaust. The history of the German language as an integral and contested part of the Jewish social landscape has been largely overshadowed by the Holocaust and its memory, and it is this history that this book sets out to tell. Now, one of the arguments that I put forward in the book is that the idea of German as a dangerous or forbidden language, which is mostly associated with the post-war period, was one stage in a long history of tensions, engagements, and disagreements over the image and function of the German language in Jewish society. So today's lecture will focus on this last stage, on the Nazification of German, and how it affected Jewish political culture. And the talk today will be divided into three parts. I will first say a few things about the book and take you through some of the trajectories that are beginning in the Enlightenment and up until the 20th century, but very briefly, and just to give you a sense of some of the stops that I cover. And I then go into the stage where German becomes not only whatever it was earlier, but also, and above all, the language of Hitler. And I will finish with a sort of a case study, which is the Eichmann Trial, which brought to the surface different threads of the Jewish history of the German language. But I will present it both as a culmination of this history, but also as a turning point in the long and convoluted and intimate and contentious Jewish history of the German language. So let me start by saying a few words on why German was a Jewish problem. German was one of many languages that represented for European Jews a prospect of cultural integration and upward mobility. And for the same reasons, it signified a threat to Jewish communal traditions. But what distinguished German from other languages was the fact that it played a central role, socially, linguistically, and ideologically, in the transformation of Jewish societies within and beyond German-speaking lands. Now, there has been extensive research on the immersion of German Jews in their country's culture and language, but the story told in this book has a broader geographical scope, and it follows the German language and its meanings in Eastern Europe, Palestine, and America. Part of the reasons for the presence of German in Jewish life across the diaspora has to do with the linguistic proximity between Yiddish and German, making German somewhat more accessible than other European languages. German served as a pathway to universal knowledge for generations of Yiddish-speaking Jews seeking to introduce modern political ideas to their communities or simply to broaden their intellectual horizons. The path from Yiddish to German was thus considered a potentially transformative one. Moreover, the acquisition of German stood at the heart of visions of Jewish emancipation in German principalities and the Habsburg Empire. It was propagated by statesmen, intellectuals, and proponents of the Jewish Enlightenment who held that for Jews to achieve a higher level of civility and to become respected members of society, they would have to abandon Yiddish in favor of German. a pure, proper, and highly esteemed language. In Eastern Europe, many proponents of the Jewish Enlightenment looked to German Jewry as a powerful model of emancipation and were well acquainted with the writings of German and German Jewish thinkers. Eastern European proponents of the Jewish Enlightenment were often labeled as Germans or Deutschen, whether pejoratively or approvingly. German was considered a particularly promising or dangerous language because it entered and transformed domains of traditional Jewish textual culture. Starting in the 1820s, some German Jewish scholars associated with the Wissenschaft des Judentums set out to apply modern methods of scholarly inquiry to the study of Judaism and published a vast body of literature in German, the universal language of knowledge. They frequently presented their work as a reinvigoration of the Jewish scholarly tradition. In the words of Leopold Zunz, one of the foremost scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, their work signified a necessary adaptation to the changing linguistic and religious habits of European Jews. He wrote in 1818, "Since we observe the Jews in our time, and we refer not only to the Jews of Germany, turning in earnest to the German language and German culture, and thereby, perhaps unwillingly, carrying Jewish literature to its grave, Wissenschaft appears to demand an account of what has been sealed." For their critics in Eastern Europe, however, this work also reflected an assimilatory impulse that undermined Hebrew's status as the chief language of Jewish erudition. German also appeared to be entering the domain of Jewish religious rituals, with prayer books and sermons given in German in various Reforms and other Ashkenazi communities of progressive proclivity starting the 1820s and onwards. The Prague-born Jewish scholar Hugo Bergman described German as a half-holy language, a language that Jews in Prague used on Sabbath and in synagogues. Or consider this observation by the writer Moshe Kleinman in 1909. When modern speakers enter a synagogue in Russia and speak in Russian, or when they enter a Polish synagogue and speak in Polish, it appears as a desecration of the place, for they are speaking Goyish in a holy place. But when entering in the very same place and speaking German, it appears as an entirely natural thing to do. German was thus more than a means of communication. It had a constitutive role in the formation of modern Jewish culture within and beyond German-speaking lands. At the same time, with the rise of anti-Semitic currents in Germany in the 1870s and 1880s, some Jewish nationalists also began labeling German as a clear vehicle of anti-Semitic hatred. It was for these reasons that many Jewish critics, both Orthodox and secular, saw German as a threat to Judaism, a threat from within and a threat from without. The power of German as a language of knowledge, of political agitation, of literature, remained, however, a clear fact. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, Jewish nationalists in Eastern Europe began recognizing the potential value of using German in order to make the Jewish nationalist call more audible. And the clearest example of this is the famous pamphlet by Leon Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation, or Auto-Emancipation, that was written by a Russian Jewish doctor based in Odessa, Leon Pinsker, in 1882, with the aim of basically energizing not only the Jewish masses, but also reaching wider audience in the West and reaching the somewhat sleepy, politically sleepy German Jewish circles and the elites. And using German was, in fact, a new potential to reach these kind of audiences, to make a move that will break the boundaries of the Jewish communal tradition and sort of unsettle and provoke Jews and non-Jews to think about the Jewish national ID and its legitimacy more seriously. In 1884, the prominent Yiddish writer Mendele Moicher Sforim translated the pamphlet into Yiddish and wrote in the preface that the pamphlet had been written in German, the language of the people whose renowned intellectuals' wisdom and humaneness is as great as the madness and evilness of its truculent fools. He pointed to the twofold load of the German language, shifting between Enlightenment and anti-Semitism. Despite this inner tension, German increasingly served as a language of Jewish nationalism. In Vienna, the Jewish Student Association Kadima established in 1885 the periodical Selbstemanzipation, a title that was a tribute to Pinsker's Auto-Emanzipation. The organization and its periodical formed channels of communication between Eastern and Western European Jewish nationalists. And an example of this is this pamphlet that was disseminated by this group, trying to basically raise money to be able to continue to maintain this periodical and its activity. And it was written as in two columns, Hebrew and German, two languages of Jewish nationalism in different ways. When Theodor Herzl established the Zionist movement in 1897, it became even more predominantly German-speaking. The movement's headquarters were located in German and Austrian cities. Its main periodicals were printed in German, as were the majority of its scholarly and political publications. The Zionist Congress was held predominantly in German, and its protocols were published exclusively in German until 1935. There were many practical benefits for having German as a Zionist lingua franca. Key among them lay in the recognition of Imperial Germany's status as a European power that could potentially support or at least not oppose the establishment of an autonomous Jewish polity in Palestine. The German orientation of the Zionist movement was instrumental also in presenting Zionism as a respectable movement that is aligned with the present political order and with the mores of European diplomacy. But the Germanophone character of early Zionism generated unease among those who believed that the movement must be invested in the formation of a modern Hebrew culture and the Hebrew-speaking community in Palestine. So German served in the history of Zionism both as a lingua franca and as an object of critique. On the one hand, it played an indispensable role in the formulation and dissemination of Jewish national ideologies, but on the other hand, it was associated with historical currents of assimilation that undermined the postulate of Jewish national unity. In other words, German was part of the problem Jewish nationalists sought to address, but also part of the solution. So I'd like to finish this sort of introductory part with making two broader points that I put forward in the book. So first, Jewish nationalism involved a complex and often painful effort to diminish the symbolic and practical significance of German as a Jewish lingua franca, to make it basically a foreign language. The question of whether this was possible, and if so, whether it was desirable, would hover in the background of various debates in the history of Jewish nationalism. Second point is that German acquired throughout the 19th century a range of meanings that rendered it a politically charged factor in Jewish life. So to understand how and why German occupied this position, it is necessary to de-Germanize the place of German in modern Jewish history, to study the diffused presence of German in Jewish life beyond German-speaking lands. This also requires us to shift the focus away from the prevalent category of German-speaking Jews and to consider the category of German-reading Jews, a broader transnational collective of Jews that exercise various degrees of fluency in German, read German literature and science, engaged with it critically, and also recognized the value of German for the advancement of Jewish society and culture. And it was indeed this scattered collective that gave the German language many of its layers of significance in Jewish historical memory since the Enlightenment until today. With the rise of Nazism, the status of German as a language of Jewish political culture was challenged significantly. But the end of the Germanophone stage was not as abrupt or as self-evident as it may seem. It was entangled with other political questions of the period and also steeped in earlier tensions over the German language and its status in the Jewish world. From 1933, the Jewish community in Palestine, or the Yishuv, saw the arrival of about 70,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria, most of whom lacking working knowledge of Hebrew. They were received with mixed sentiments by the established segments of the Yishuv. While the incoming immigrants enhanced the Yishuv's size, boosted its economy, and included a significant number of highly educated individuals, they were often portrayed as profoundly rooted in German culture, an assumption that was not wrong in many cases. According to a common allegation, they were the group of immigrants most resistant to adopting Hebrew. In May 1933, the Zionist activist Eliezer Yaffe described the German immigration, quote, as a great danger to our revival movement. They might settle in their own neighborhoods, conducting the lives they had had in the Vaterland that threw them away. And they might indeed establish German schools, publish German newspapers, and preach for assimilation. In 1935, the right-wing Hebrew newspaper Doar Hayom published an essay that admitted that the monolingual aspiration of Hebraism, the movement to advance the Hebrew language in Palestine, had failed to materialize. He writes, "Walk in the streets of our land, and especially in Jerusalem, and you will hear an unwarranted mixture of tongues." The reporter counted the different languages he could hear on the bus from Haifa to Jerusalem: Hebrew, Arabic, English, and German, and added a warning. "I believe that through the spoken and publicly read German, the Yiddish language will sneak into our camp. From within the walls of spoken German in this land, I can smell the scent of Yiddish. In Haifa in particular, the sound of the language of Hitler is heard in all its accents." So it's not only the language of Hitler that sort of intrudes Palestine, but also Yiddish appears as a dialect of the language of Hitler. So the anti-Yiddishist impulse in Zionism was actually strengthened by this transformation in how German could be perceived or presented in Jewish politics. Now, a counter-argument to anti-German rhetoric appeared in January 1940 in Davar, the official newspaper of the Yishuv. Dov Sadan, the editor of the literary supplement of the newspaper, opposed the argument and said that the idea that German is the language of our enemy is just limited. He wondered whether this fact should matter at all from the perspective of Hebraism, given that English and French, which were by no means the languages of the enemy, were equally problematic for anyone seeking to promote Hebrew culture and language. And he writes, "German is the language of Kant and Hegel, without which our present thought is inconceivable. It is also the language of Schiller and Goethe, without which our present poetry is inconceivable. It is the language of defender of truth and humanists and lovers of Israel in particular, from Lessing to Thomas Mann, and it is also the language of our own, of Börne and Heine, of Lassalle and Hess, of Zunz and Goethe, of Herzl and Nordau, of Freud and Einstein." So is it possible to separate between the different meanings of German? This question was tackled directly around the matter of translation. In September 1944, the committee jury of translation awards, sponsored by the City Council of Tel Aviv, failed to reach a decision and canceled the prize for that year. It soon turned out that the committee disagreed on whether to award the prize to new Hebrew versions of Goethe's Faust. The cancellation was received with both praise and dissent. For those supporting the decision, it confirmed the view that the persecution of Jews by the Third Reich implicated German culture in its entirety. One writer asserted that, quote, "For persons of Jewish descent to be able to enjoy the creativity of the German nation, whether in word, sound, or color, this is a clear sign of a certain flaw in their soul. Immigrants from Germany and Austria should likewise be expected to uproot their fondness for this damned nation and its culture, to expel its language from their mouths, to remove its authors from their bookshelves, to detest its poetry." Such stance did not go uncontested, however. A commentator from the left-leaning journal Al-Hamishmar asked, "Should Goethe pay for the sins of Hitler? It is unthinkable that experts of Hebrew literature would choose to take revenge on our behalf in this manner." Ultimately, the anti-German approach prevailed and the prize was cancelled. In 1945, the committee met again, this time deciding to give the prize to a translator from Yiddish into Hebrew. In the first years of its existence, Israel continued carrying out an informal boycott of German and in the country's public sphere, not allowing it to be recited, sung, or spoken in official and cultural venues. Obviously, in today's standards, such a perception is quite excessive and not entirely rational in this inability to distinguish between different functions of German. But this is just a testament of how profoundly important and sensitive the German language and its sound were after the Holocaust, and some of it, of course, continued over many years. But according to a common perception that is still widely held, this post-war association between the German language and Nazi anti-Semitism was ultimately an emotional response to the shocking brutality of the German language, that the sound of German evokes memories of the past, very brutal memories of murder and persecution and anti-Semitic propaganda. And that's definitely an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story, because as the examples that are brought above and are expanded on in the book show, there was more to it. First of all, there was the political instrumentality of this argument, in this allowing it to make some arguments in favor of strengthening the hold of Hebrew culture and sort of some kind of political power move between different groups of the Jewish society in Palestine, different kinds of groups of immigrants. And the second thing that it shows is that it was not only an immediate response to what happened in the Third Reich and in Europe during the Second World War, but it was actually rooted in a longer and a more deeply rooted discomfort or even fear from the German language and its detrimental impact on Jews. And in this sense, what happened in 1933 was just one step that allowed the argument that it is illegitimate or very problematic for Jews to use German. So this argument was now used in a new key and in a very powerful one. On September 10th, 1952, Israel signed a reparations agreement with West Germany. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer headed the German delegation, whereas the Israeli one was led by Moshe Sharet, its Russian-born Minister of Foreign Affairs. On the following day, Sharet gave a short statement on the agreement and on his meeting with Adenauer. He concluded his statement with the following words. "In my conversation with Dr. Adenauer, we discussed the chasm separating our two peoples in view of what happened. The conversation was conducted in German, not in Hitler's German, but in the language of Goethe, the language we had both learned before Hitler's rise to power." Now, he was not saying it, as a joke or just as an anecdote. This was the final part of the statement on a historic and very controversial moment in the very short history of Israel. But it attests to the sensitivity and how much the language question was ultimately explosive. Sharet himself was born in the Russian Pale of Settlement. He immigrated to Ottoman Palestine at the age of 12. He never spent any lengthy period in a German-speaking land, and he learned German at home and in his high school, which he attended in Palestine. As a Zionist politician, German was ultimately an integral part of his own social landscape. So his cautious words convey a realization that German had obtained the position of a tainted language. He seems to have been aware that the image of an Israeli politician speaking to a German politician in German might evoke among Israelis a sense of discomfort or anger. and this sensitivity would continue to characterize Israeli political culture throughout the 1950s. But the near absence of German from the Israeli public sphere came to an end with the Eichmann Trial. In May 1960, Israeli secret services captured former Nazi official Adolf Eichmann in a suburb of Buenos Aires. As an officer at the Reich Main Security Office, Eichmann planned and oversaw the systematic deportation of Jews to concentration camps. After the war, he lived under false identity in Argentina until an intelligence tip allowed the Israeli state to bring him to trial. The Israeli government, under the David Ben-Gurion, wished to imbue the trial with the historical and pedagogical significance, demonstrating the magnitude of the destruction of European Jewry and exhibiting Israel's commitment to bring Nazi criminals to justice. The trial also provided Eichmann with the opportunity to plead for his innocence in his own words. Parts of the trial were transmitted live on the radio, and recorded short video recordings of the trial were shown in cinemas across Israel. The event received extensive coverage and gripped Israeli society and the Jewish world from the beginning of the trial in April 1961 until Eichmann's execution in the following year. The trial was held in a public hall in Jerusalem, accommodating hundreds of spectators and reporters from across the world. A major practical challenge concerned the administration of the languages spoken in the trial. The district court stated and dictated that the Eichmann trial will be conducted in the Hebrew language, but participants used by necessity several languages, including English, German, and Yiddish, with simultaneous translations from and into Hebrew. The German language was central to the conduct of the trial and to the efforts to prove Eichmann's guilt. But the trial also brought German to the fore in its capacity as a language of Jewish life before the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe. So in the remainder of this talk, I will present the different functions that the German language had in the trial and how they were received at the time and what the encounter between them looked like. So I will start with Eichmann's own language, and I should say that I'm not going to go into Eichmann's own German, not in any linguistic sense. It's not my expertise, although it's definitely a worthy topic of discussion and of research, and there's quite a lot that has been written on it, and we can discuss it maybe in the Q&A. But I will mainly focus on how it sounded to those around him and how people made sense of Eichmann's German and of the Nazi German that was basically performed during the trial and shortly afterwards. The German that Eichmann spoke had a somewhat shocking effect. The first Israeli to encounter it was Avner Less, or originally Werner Less, a police officer who interrogated Eichmann after his arrest. Less recalled his first impression. His German was hideous. At first I had a very difficult time understanding him at all. The jargon of the Nazi bureaucrat, pronounced in a mixture of Berlin and Austrian accents, and further garbled by his liking for endlessly complicated sentences in which he himself would occasionally get lost. Less was writing from a position of familiarity, having been born in 1916 in Berlin and leaving Germany in 1933. The German that appeared in Nazi administrative documents, which served a crucial role in the prosecutor's attempt to prove his guilt, also required a good deal of clarification. Bureau 06, the unit entrusted with the investigation of Eichmann, recruited 30 German-speaking officers. Several among them were tasked with the assignment of preparing a dictionary of Nazi terms and concepts into Hebrew. Most of the dictionary, about 60 pages long, was dedicated to bureaucratic and technical terms, But the dictionary was also a sustained effort to translate and unify and basically understand various other euphemisms such as Arisierung, Blutschutzgesetz, Bereinigung des Judenproblems, Zwangssterilisierung, Untermenschtum, Entjudung, and Eindeutschung. Shalom Rosenfeld, who covered the trial for an Israeli newspaper, noted after examining the dictionary that the various entries reveal the pompous, Teutonic, arrogant, threatening terminology that the sick Nazi mind invented in the days of great darkness of the German culture and the German language. And here you see the article with the German terms in the headline, something that was unthinkable for most of the history of Israel, and now also assuming some kind of familiarity among his readership with the German language in different ways, and also sort of capturing the shocking element of these words when they are uttered and shown after the Holocaust in Israel. The process of questioning Eichmann relied extensively and considerably on the prosecution's ability to prove that Nazi terms, as they appeared in the pertinent documentation and in the defendant's own testimony, indicated Eichmann's premeditated effort to coordinate the mass killing of European Jews. So it was very difficult to prove that Eichmann was actually conscious and fully planning the mass killing of European Jews, because the language used in these documents was often elusive in its nature, and proving what actually the words meant and what was the implication was part of the prosecutor's main challenge, and in this sense it necessitated a certain engagement with the language, with what they could mean, what they actually meant in different periods, and so on. In one session, Eichmann was asked to clarify the meaning of Sonderbehandlung, for example, special treatment, a term that appeared in correspondence with Eichmann's own signature. He denied that the term stood for killing, insisting that it had different meanings, including non-lethal ones, such as Germanization or something like that. In another part of the questioning, Eichmann was asked to explain the significance of the term prompt, like schlagartig, with regard to the deportation of the entire Jewish population of Budapest. Elsewhere, Eichmann argued that the words Vernichtung and Ausrottung, as used by the Nazi regime in 1939, did not denote the physical destruction of Judaism, but actually its political destruction. In another section, Eichmann tried to convince the prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, that the meaning of the term Endlösung, final solution, as it had been used in 1941, was deportation to Madagascar and not systematic killing. So the listeners of the trial were introduced to the significance of Nazi terminology and linguistic concealment in the planning and practice of the destruction of European Jewry. Matters of terminology were also addressed extensively in testimonies of witnesses, of Holocaust survivors mostly, who introduced both the administrative language of the ghettos and of the camps, as well as the slang developed by those interned there. One witness introduced a host of terms denoting the structures of Auschwitz concentration camp, such as the Kinderblock, children block, or Familienlager, Strafkommando, and Blockälteste. Another Auschwitz survivor, Raya Kagan, who was assigned administrative tasks in the camp, was asked specifically about Nazi euphemisms designating the killing of Jews. Such terms were already introduced to readership of historiography of the Holocaust and in literature produced by Holocaust survivors, but the trial brought the Nazi language in an auditory form to a mass audience. Apart from questions of terminology and camouflaged language, Eichmann's voice and words fascinated the audience. When he responded to the first questions concerning his guilt, im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig, namely not guilty as charged, One newspaper transcribed the German words into Hebrew letters, noting, quote, the serenity, monotonous tone with only the word nicht being emphasized. Another commentator noted, quote, the German language was heard here, and it was heard also there, in the camps, in the ghettos. How strange. Other reporters transcribed into Hebrew letters Eichmann's word yavol when he was asked to confirm his identity, and here it appears in the front headline of the most popular newspaper. This picture was taken just outside the court in Jerusalem. And Shabtai Tevet, writing for Haaretz, noted, however, that the moment when Eichmann started speaking was anticlimactic in how it normalized him, basically. Suddenly, it appeared that the shocking and inconceivable has turned into a presence that speaks in the language of humans. From now on the introduction was to be conducted using normal words, all of which could be found in a dictionary. On the following day, when the prosecutors played in the courtroom a recording of Eichmann's interrogation by the Israeli police, shortly after his arrest, Rosenfeld, the writer for Ma'ariv, described the scene. Eichmann's voice produced an echo as if it were coming from a deep grave. A commentator for Davar, Moshe Tavor, noticed the proximity between Eichmann and Hitler's German as it emerged from the recorded interrogation. And I quote, the same Viennese dialect, same mixture of typical Austrian vocabulary and Nazi jargon, same rolling R, in short, the voice of his master. 2 days later, Tavor noted that Eichmann's use of the verb verkraften, denoting the administrative ability to process the deportations of the hundreds of thousands of Jews, revealed Eichmann's rootedness in the vocabulary of the SS and the Gestapo. He noted, quote, that Eichmann's vocabulary is taken to a large degree from the vocabulary of the Nazis. Despite the years past, quote, Eichmann continues to think through the categories of the Nazi order. Other commentators associated Eichmann's distinctive ways of expression with mere tediousness. The voice is deep, dim, monolithic. Dozens of foreign reporters have come here specially to hear him, and now they sit in the courtroom, the many reporters and the audience, impatiently witnessing their decaying alertness and diminishing expectation as they are yawning. All that he says, whatever he explains in long, convoluted German sentences, is so utterly predictable that it leaves no room for drama. Elsewhere, Eichmann's voice was described as haunting, the metal voice of a machine, a voice that brings back echoes from the past. In Davar, another newspaper, a commentator noted that the defense lawyer were pursuing their efforts entirely in clumsy German, quote, filled with subclauses and grammatical notes, a painful German crushed in this trial by obscene distortions. On the following day, Shmuel Schnitzer, another writer, described the pain involved in listening to Eichmann's sticky paste of words produced by his sickly verbosity, grey dullness, and painful dwelling in details of his recorded testimony. Another writer remarked that those who did not speak German were at a disadvantage in deciphering the Eichmann riddle. Only those who are able to follow Eichmann's convoluted sentences and those who can assess his desperate efforts to express himself adequately can move a step closer to sorting this question. Hannah Arendt, who reported about the trial for The New Yorker, similarly noted that Eichmann's German was marked by the use of bureaucratic jargon and empty stock phrases, proving his inability to provide a clear thought. And she writes, some of the comedy cannot be conveyed in English because it lies in Eichmann's heroic fight with the German language, which invariably defeats him. Eichmann's German was thus a sensational aspect of the trial because it appeared to capture aspects of the Nazi mindset more than the content of his answers. At the same time, the idea of German as the Nazi language was challenged. Eichmann language conveyed confusion, submissiveness, and awkwardness. It did not really fit into the idea that Eichmann was the sophisticated and almost psychopathic architect of mass murders driven by anti-Semitic hatred and ideological zeal. I mean, the image of how he spoke and the explanation and the arguments actually revealed something a bit more complex about the way he understood himself or his role and what his commitment to Nazism was about. Eichmann turned ideas of Nazi Germany into an unmediated experience for his listeners, but also forced them to contemplate on what Nazism involved and how the Nazi mind operated during the war. Lastly, I will now turn to the encounter between the different meanings or the different types of German that were heard in the courtroom. So the logistical setup of the trial was designed to enable communication between German and Hebrew speakers, even though virtually all the main participants in the trial could speak German. The three judges were born and raised in Germany. Eichmann and his lawyers obviously communicated exclusively in German, and the prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, was born in 1915 in Habsburg, Galicia, and was quite proficient in German as well. In other words, Nazi German was not the only type of German that was encountered and given platform during the trial. And while the simultaneous translation rendered the discussions with the defendant and his lawyers accessible to the wider audience, it did not have a facilitating function for the trial's protagonists. When the judges tried to address the defendant, they had to wait for the translators to deliver their words from Hebrew to German and vice versa. And the translators occasionally misunderstood or mistranslated the original. In a number of cases in which the judges noted such mistakes, they intervened and corrected the translation. And sometimes they decided to simply save the hassle. In one case in which Eichmann failed to answer the Judge Moshe Landau's question, Landau interjected, "Perhaps I will explain it in German," repeating the question in German and afterward returning to Hebrew. In other cases, a judge noted Eichmann's obscure terms, asking him to choose a clearer term in German in his response. The ceaseless translations turned the trial into an event that involved long pauses every step of the way. In some cases, the prosecutor and the judges chose not to embrace the imperative of conducting the trial in Hebrew. Prosecutor Hausner frequently resorted to German when interrogating Eichmann directly, in particular when raising follow-up questions or when seized with anger. When Hausner appeared to be impatient with Eichmann's convoluted and evasive answers, he turned directly to German. In one case, for example, he shouted, "Haben Sie es gesagt? Ja oder nein? Did you say it? Yes or no?" So these linguistic shifts were rarely, if at all, recorded in the trial's written protocols. Upon the completion of the prosecutor and defense attorney's statements, the judges were given the opportunity to ask Eichmann any questions they thought required further clarification. It was in this context that the facade of a linguistic barrier between the judges and the defendant was entirely abandoned. The judge Yitzhak Rave began by saying in Hebrew, "I will ask you a few questions in German," after which he turned his face to Eichmann and took off his glasses. What followed was a lengthy exchange between the two, held in German. Rave's decision may have been related not only to time constraints and impatience, but also to the topic on which he decided to focus. His concluding questions did not involve Eichmann's deeds and whereabouts in his official capacity, but pertained to Eichmann's conscious and moral convictions. Rave invoked an early comment Eichmann had made in the interrogation, in which he said that his unalloyed commitment to the Nazi law was a result of his understanding of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which for Eichmann meant the individual's exhibiting of committed lawfulness. It was on this statement that the judge Rave sought to dwell, not only exploring Eichmann's dubious understanding of Kant, but also inquiring how it squared, how it fit with the kind of actions in which he had engaged, organizing a mass killing of innocent human beings. On this matter, Rave's didactic line of questioning led Eichmann to admit that his incapacity as a Nazi officer, he did not follow Kant's imperative. Rave's direct and uninterrupted dialogue with Eichmann in their shared language proved to be one of the few instances in which Eichmann admitted a certain personal responsibility for his actions. After this exchange, the linguistic dam could no longer be rebuilt. Judge Benjamin Halevi started his series of questions by stating, "I will also allow myself to deviate from the Hebrew order of the trial and ask the defendant in his own language." Not in his own language and not his, without adding any other justification. The presiding judge, Moshe Landau, afterwards asked his questions in Hebrew, then immediately translated them by himself into German. During these few hours, the courtroom was virtually a German-speaking room where the Nazi perpetrator conversed with the Israeli judges, all of them Jewish immigrants and refugees from Germany, in their mother tongue. So, what happened then when the different meanings of German met in Jerusalem? The idea of German as the language of Nazi brutality received its performative validation, but it was consigned to a defensive, weak, almost pathetic position. Moreover, German also appeared as the language of Central European Jewry and of significant segments of Eastern European Jewry, and as a vehicle through which the Israeli court exercised its power over Eichmann. It is therefore not merely a symbolic factor that the trial was profoundly multilingual and heavily Germanophone. This fact added a crucial sensory dimension to the listener's encounter and re-encounter with the German, Jewish, and German-Jewish pasts. The Eichmann trial granted the German language a degree of audibility that was unprecedented in the history of the State of Israel. In so doing, it enabled a gradual, often reluctant, return to Germanophone features of Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. And in this sense, it helped normalize the German language or demystify it in some ways. So this is I can conclude with maybe just one last thought. There is no other language in Jewish historical memory that is associated with the persecution or with anti-Jewish violence, even though the entire trajectory of Jewish history is often marked or at least presented with an emphasis of persecution, whether it is in antiquity or in the Middle Ages or the pogroms in Russia, Dreyfus affair. I mean, there are different highlights in the history of anti-Semitism or of anti-Jewish persecution, but the language of the perpetrator is never sort of taken as complicit in the actions or as a language that carries the memory with it. Now, of course, it's part of the explanation for this is that there was no other crime like the Holocaust. There was no event with the magnitude of destruction like the events of Nazi Germany, and no maybe use of the language and its propaganda in similar ways. But as I hope I could sort of show during this presentation and how I elaborate in the book, the German language had always this capacity to absorb an additional layer of significance, making it more than a language that always has an additional element of power, whether it is positive, negative, whether it is offering a promise and a prospect, or whether it is an immediate danger. And it is this sort of element of power that continues to shape the German language, its function, and its memory in Jewish history. That's all. Thank you.
Marc, thank you so much for these very exciting insights into your research and also in your book. In case you're interested in purchasing this wonderful book, please feel free to contact the author directly for more information, also for a small discount. I will now open the floor up for questions from our in-person audience. And questions can be asked either in English or in German, and I will be happy to translate if need be. So please.
This doesn't work.
I think I don't need this microphone.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation to ask two quick questions. The first one is, you said in your presentation that at the beginning you said that when in Poland or in Russia someone would come into a synagogue and would speak Polish or Russian, this would seem a little bit unnatural, whereas, or desecration even, whereas German is kind of a more appropriate language. So I was wondering, does this mean that the Jewish communities in Poland and Russia were mainly speaking German or Yiddish, or was what was the background of this remark? Mm-hmm. And my second question would be: could you just quickly outline if German has a special role in Israel today? With like, this is a totally new generation. Holocaust is 70 years ago. So I was wondering if German has a special place today in Israel as well, or if it's considered a language comparable to, I don't know, Swedish or Italian. Thank you.
Thank you. Two very good questions. Regarding the first point that the author that I quoted made, so you can understand this quotation in different ways. What does it mean when German is heard in synagogues? So in part it has to do with the fact that, again, the distance between German and Yiddish is not always significant, at least not in auditory relations. These are different languages, but according to the author, Kleinman, German sounds less foreign because it's closer to a language that is Jewish, that is not foreign at all. So in this sense, there is some kind of family resemblance and family relation, which makes German less foreign. But there's another element to it, and which is the fact that, yes, both in Poland and in Russia, it's not that Jews spoke German or learned German as if it was a natural thing to do, but increasing numbers of Jews, especially those that wanted to either go to study in university or just expand their own horizons or move to Jewish nationalist circles or Jewish socialist or non-Jewish socialist circles, had to basically to acquire German and to be able to get it. And in this sense, German was part of Jewish multilingualism in Eastern Europe, even though it was not a language that they necessarily and officially embraced, but more like there was some kind of fluidity between different languages, which is ultimately a way of thinking about languages that is no longer actually relevant today, where we all learn specific languages and then declare ourselves that we are speakers. Our native tongue is this one, and the foreign languages that we learn are a few others. Whereas in the context of Imperial Russia and of the Habsburg Empire, there was no such thing, and multilingualism was the name of the game, not only in Jewish contexts, but there was always some kind of minimal acquaintance with all the languages of the region, of peasants, whether it's Ukrainian or Polish, and of course German and Yiddish. So in this sense, German was always accessible and visible, and the question of whether it was appropriate to a synagogue still required some clarification or some kind of engagement, and that's I think what he tried to convey without actually explaining how come German is more respectable and more welcome inside the synagogue, which is supposed to be a purely Jewish space for ritual. Yeah. And about German in Israel today, that's it's a topic that is constantly changing. Obviously, generational shifts do their thing, and today, as is well known, Germans, many Israelis moved to Germany and to Berlin, and there's a fairly vibrant, not only Jewish community, but also some kind of for an Israeli community and some Hebrew-speaking literature and Hebrew literature produced in Germany, and lots of activities. It's no longer a forbidden language in many ways. It's quite a popular language in universities, and in this sense, it is just another foreign language. Having said that, it's still a language that requires some kind of explanation. I mean, I'm saying it also from my own experience as someone who learned German at the university and without a family background or anything, that it's not something that you just learn German because it's a cool language. I mean, nobody would dare to say that, or because it's a useful language. Even if it is, it requires some kind of another step of either wanting to understand the world where you came from, or wanting to get into specific culture and European scenes. Just one example is a novel written by an Israeli who lives in Berlin. I think it's called Broken German, which is written in broken German, really like German that is not proper. And it, in a sense, is kind of owning the fact that Jewish relation to the German language is conflicted and difficult, and this ability to just embrace the German language in its entirety is gone, at least for those who are not born in Germany. So something of the sensitivity remained, but it's more some echoes of the past rather than the actual anxiety in some ways that you feel from the discourse that I was analyzing in the book. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Also, please, if you could, for the next questions, just briefly state your name and maybe, just so that we know in this small group who we are talking to. That would be great. Thank you. Marianne.
Yeah, Marianne Winsberger, Wiener Wiesenthal Institute. My question was, you started actually out with a history of German as a Jewish problem in terms of readership, which I found fascinating. So the written word is referred to. And you end, for this talk at least, with the mediality also of recordings of the German language. So my question would be how this is reflected in your work, and how this also adds layers to the semantics of the German language when you hear something. And it's, that's my question.
Yeah, really great question, and it's true that the focus and the sort of the center of gravity of the book changes. I mean, in the 18th and 19th century, the danger of the language was not so much in its capacity as a language that is used. Again, it was not such a big deal on what happened on the ground, but the encounter with the written German word, that was the problem. And a key moment in that is really the fact that, for instance, the first modern Bible translations into German by Moses Mendelssohn and later by his students were a very clearly ideological attempt to shape the linguistic habits of German Jews, to make them better Germans, or to make them Germans and Jews. But I mean, it was a real thing, and the translation itself, which was quite loyal to the original and came out of devotion to Judaism and to the ability to keep the Bible accessible and important for Jews across the Ashkenazi world. The fact that it was in the German language was crucial, and it was also what was also boycotted by more orthodox or reactionary communities and rabbis in Eastern Europe and so on for similar reasons. And again, in this context, it's quite fitting that Mendelssohn's Bible translation was in really in proper German, but in Hebrew letters. I mean, also to make them more accessible to Yiddish speakers, but also because it could keep some of the aura of the original Bible while actually, drawing readership into the German language. And, with the 19th century and the emergence of Jewish press in the German language and of popular literature, that is, like the formation of a bourgeois, a middle-class Jewish community that is, rooted in the German language, that writes immensely, that reads all the scholarly journals of the Wissenschaft des Judentums. It was still a matter of just spreading the word in its written form, and that's also how they reached audience in Eastern Europe, through translation or through the German original. Whereas with the 20th century, where it's no longer the press that is the center of events and the main mediator between different Jewish communities and Jewish diaspora, something about the sound of the German becomes more important. Obviously, the way that the German language was associated with Nazism had to do dramatically with the very skilled and elaborate use of radio in Nazi propaganda, and the fact that speeches and rallies were accessible not only to those that were there, but also across the world, leaving a very strong impact. I think it says something about also the not only the Jewish context, but also how the image of languages and how the emotional load that they carry is less meditated in the written form, but mainly in how they sound. There are relics of that in earlier periods. There is, for instance, a famous essay by Mark Twain called "The Awful German Language," which is about how he, coped with the German language and its awfulness. But the awfulness that he encountered was about the grammar and the clumsiness and but the awfulness today again changed its meanings to something about the brutality and the fact that it's like a crude and language that is aggressive by its nature. These meanings always existed in some ways in popular thought, but they really intensified after the First World War and after the Holocaust. So the explanations to that have to do with sort of the material context in some ways, but they do say something bigger about how the thought about language also changed over time, and it's a sort of it's a meta question that deserves to be actually taken seriously. I agree. Yeah.
Do we have other questions, Stephen?
Hey, Stephen Nairn, Fortuna Video Archive. I had two questions. One, building off of your Mark Twain quote, the book sounds great. I'm looking forward to reading it, so forgive me. These are ignorant questions. I haven't read the book yet, but do you look outside of the Israeli context and look at German as a Jewish problem, let's say, in the United States or in other locations as well? Because clearly there's some clear similarities between how German is treated, not just by Jews, but by even non-Jews, but certainly American Jews as well. That's one question. And the other one was, I find it, of course, fascinating how you describe German as sort of a bridge from Yiddish into a more modern, cultural language, a sort of Haskalah, that traditional sort of Haskalah move. But there's also another German as a Jewish problem, which is that Yiddish of course, absorbs lots of Germanisms in the sort of Deutschmarisch, right? Which then later becomes an issue. Initially, it's the Yiddishists are trying to show how educated they are along the lines of sort of the Haskalah. But at some point, there's a shift where they want to, expunge the Deutschmarisms and get back to a natural Yiddish. Is that covered in the book at all?
Yeah, thank you. So, America, yes, one of the things that I do mention in the book and bring as part of the context is the fact that many of the sensitivities that I talk about are not essentially Jewish or not only about Jews themselves. In America, maybe one example is the fact that, yes, there are very important parallels. For example, the reform movement in America in the mid-19th century was a German-speaking one. And not only among those who came from Germany, but also their kids. And, the sermons were often conducted in German because this is the language of the Reform Judaism. And that changed, after 30, 40 years, but it was not just about, practical thing, because as one of the, I think Rabbi David Einhorn, who was German-born, but one of the important American rabbis, said, if you stop using the German language, you stop understanding Reform Judaism. It's just, it won't do without. So there's something of this also continued into the American context. But I'll give another example which says something of the opposite direction. After the First World War, when Germany, the aggressor, lost and then America won, something changed about how universal languages operated around that time. German used to be, until the First World War, the main language of science. If you did any scientific work, virtually in any realm, and definitely in natural sciences, German was the first language you had to learn. French was important, and there were other languages as well, but German was, the elite language of scientific work. Scientific journals, again, in the German language, were the most important in many, many fields. After the First World War, there was, again, a de facto boycott of the German language as a scientific language, and German basically never recovered from the First World War, post-war shock. But the boycott ultimately vanished, after a few years, and after the Second World War, there were different ways of singling out different languages for their practicality, but the idea of German as a language that it's not okay to use because it's associated with what the Germans did to the Americans or to others, this argument was not really operative. Whereas in the Jewish context, this argument did have a very, very important and long-lasting valence and vehemence. And in this sense, there's always a global story to tell and something that is bigger than the Jewish sensitivity, but the Jewish sensitivity to it is related to more specific tensions and sort of internal disagreements that cannot be just applied to other contexts, but there's always room for comparison and also for analogy, and you see that in the book. As for your second question, just for context, so there is this type of use of Yiddish, which is called Deutschmerisch, which is basically a Germanized Yiddish, an attempt to speak, but mainly to write Yiddish in a more German way, using more German verbs and grammatical forms to make it sound more German. But not just because there are no Yiddish equivalent, but because Yiddish would benefit from becoming closer to the German language. It would absorb part of its practicality if it sort of toned down, or at least controlled a bit the Jewish presence in the Yiddish language, and take some of the aura of the German language. This is maybe not the fairest description, but that's roughly accepting this idea that German is a higher language than Yiddish, and Yiddish should aspire to reach the German language, at least in some ways. Some even suggested that Yiddish should change its alphabet to Roman letters for the same reasons. And since the early 20th century and up until the Holocaust, there was a constant debate in the Jewish linguistic sphere, basically, over what to make of Deutschmerisch. Is it beautiful Yiddish? Is it proper? More respectable, more European? Is it something that should be encouraged, or is it a shameful, deformation of the character of the Yiddish language? And there were arguments in both directions, and as the more Yiddish became a proud Jewish national language for different parts of the Jewish diaspora, especially in Lithuania, Poland, and in the US, the arguments for defending the Yiddish language from the German influence became stronger. And yeah, so I do recount this this debate, but I show that it's not, even though it was ultimately a debate about language, about keeping a language pure from foreign influences, which is something that every language has in different ways until today, this topic was extremely political and extremely emotional for many of those who participated in these debates, precisely because German was not just another foreign language, but it was a language that captivated and drew Jews away from their own language, from their parents' language, from their tradition. At least this was the common perception. And even in the debates about Deutschmirisch after 1933 became entangled with the debates of how come Jews want to make Yiddish more German when it is the language of Hitler. So yeah, these sort of different linguistic debates often turned political with the changing context of the period. Yeah.
We do have another question, please.
Michael Miller, Central European University. I have a comment before my question, and it's just that I was struck by how Mendele Mocher-Sform bent over backwards to get rid of the German in his translation of Pinsker. Right, the title in Yiddish has Gula and Sores, and essentially he's looking for all of these ways to avoid translating directly from German, which he could have done.
Yeah.
So it's sort of the opposite of Deutschmirisch.
That's
So
right.
the question is more about what I would call German as a Jewish studies problem. Yeah, when I studied Jewish history, there were two foundational languages, and these were Hebrew and German. And this was 25 years ago when I started. And it was sort of a given that if you were going to be studying Sephardic Jewry, Ashkenazic Jewry, late antiquity, that you needed German because all of the foundational literature in the 19th century and early 20th century was written in German. And then also after the Second World War, a lot of the, especially when it came to biblical and late antiquity, you needed German. If you're dealing with post-war, you needed German. Mm-hmm. So this is something that you didn't reflect on tonight, and it's something you don't reflect on in the book. A magnificent book, by the way. And maybe right now you could reflect on German as a Jewish studies problem in the 21st century.
Okay, I shall reflect. Yeah, it's again, this is a Jewish studies problem, which is part of a bigger problem of German as a language of science in the study of the ancient world, in Assyriology and Roman studies and law and linguistics and the drive towards the German language in the Wissenschaft des Judentums was also ideological in the sense that this is the language in which science is done. And if we want to basically save Jewish studies from oblivion and to study Jewish textual tradition in a productive way and also in a way that would be received by the German academia, I mean, all of the scholars that were working at the time were basically independent scholars. They were not part of the German academia. They just did it basically to make Jewish studies a more legitimate field of study when it's done also by Jews who come from, who bring their own Jewish background and linguistic skills and sort of ways of reading that maybe non-Jewish readers would not necessarily be so part of. So yeah, one element of it is that Jewish studies problem is part of another 21st century problem of how to deal with scholarship produced in the 19th century, often with an ideological leaning, or at least with an audience that is not just about learning the Jewish past or the Jewish literary tradition, but also making a bigger claim about the legitimacy of Jewish studies as a field, and it's part of the problem that in this specific sense, studying German for Jewish studies purposes is studying German as a dead language, because it's study German as a language of research and of study. It's sort of detaching it from your question, basically, of how German became something else later. And is it possible to really distinguish, again, between the different uses of German in the 19th century and 20th century? Is it possible to read German or to recite German today, or to read Goethe, example, to go back to the example, without thinking about how the German language had become tainted later? So the easy question is, of course, people do it, and it's just a practical necessity. But at least in my impression is that there is still quite a bit of reluctance to take German as another neutral language of Jewish studies, or to take it up properly or seriously, rather than just acquiring a sufficient knowledge in order to skim through largely outdated literature and just take from it the pieces of empirical data that is necessary for research. I mean, that's my impression from universities, from university years. But there's a broader discussion that could be done about that as well. So I accept that there's more to say about that, and the book can only begin, basically, go in that direction. Yeah.
We do have another question, the gentleman right behind Michael Miller.
Konrad Kleving from the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, Germany. So first of all, allow me to thank you for your exciting talk. And then maybe allow me for 2 comments, or maybe questions from an Eastern European perspective. One of it is partly German, partly Eastern European as a perspective. I admired how you dwelled upon the relationship between German and Yiddish as in the 19th century and within Jewish nationalism. But occasionally I wondered if you still underestimate the proximity of the 2 languages. Let me give 2 examples shortly. The first one, in the Book of Vienna, most of the Jews there went over to German as a language, and most of all, under Habsburg rule, I mean, and most of all, they were obviously quite content of having common institutions, German institutions, with their Catholic and Protestant German neighbors who lived there as another minority. So there obviously it seemed to them obviously to be a small step to change the language. Mm-hmm. And the second example, when the German army entered into Bucharest in 1915, the ethnic Romanians had mostly left, whereas the strong Jewish community had mostly stayed there. And there's quite a few sources that cite the impression of the Germans that they had entered into a German-speaking town. Mm-hmm. So also the Germans, before the Holocaust, often had the sense of proximity to the Yiddish language and the German language as acquired by Yiddish speakers. Mm-hmm. So I would dare to say that they were very close and not just somehow close. Mm-hmm. And my maybe you could respond to that line of thought. And the other element is goes back to the question, whereas if German was more appropriate in the synagogue than Polish or Russian, again, I would say that the proximity was so close, and German in this context was not a threat to Jewish existence, because, as far as I know or would think, an acquisition of Polish and Russian was a relatively new phenomenon and related to assimilation to Polish or Russian societies, whereas maintaining or dwelling upon German was not a threat to the group existence as such in in vast areas of Eastern Europe at that time. So that would also be a question to maybe to comment on.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, very important context and in some ways corrective, and I really appreciate that. So I take your point, the first one about the proximity between Yiddish and German, in some ways, and especially the Bukovina context and the Bucharest as well, but. For the purpose of the discussion, I would also push back and say that there were many types of Yiddish. Some were quite closer to German, and in the Bukovina, the fact, I mean, the Bukovina Jews were fairly famous for being way more invested in German culture as a whole, as part of being proud members of the Habsburg Empire, whereas other Yiddish speakers, like their relatively neighbors from the Russian Empire, especially the Orthodox ones or the Hasidic ones, their Yiddish was actually different. They were far more Slavic, far more Hebraic, and basically was not the same as German, and they could not easily understand German, and German speakers could not easily understand them. So I agree that if you go into Eastern Europe, you find the question of linguistic affinity in a more pronounced way than maybe I say, but nonetheless there are different variations that I'm not equipped to comment on from a linguistic point of view, but that did actually have an influence on how Jews were perceived as carriers of the German language or as potential allies of Germany or of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that was a topic that sort of exploded in some ways during the First World War, when the question of national loyalty became so loaded. So I mean, I can only agree, and I think that specific topics, let's say specific studies of Jewish multilingualism that would try to tell the story of the German language and Jewish life in a more local context would actually, challenge some of the things that I said basically in the first part of the article, because there's always nuances and differences and local emphasis and different approaches, and also not only along national lines, but also class and question of the type of interaction with the non-Jewish community, gender, profession, again, political affinity, socialism, and so on. So the more you zoom in, the more careful you need to do with these generalizations. But I agree that it's not as simple as that. And maybe just for the purpose of time, I think I'll wrap also the second question into the first one, that in the Eastern European context, you do find some kind of the question of how German and Yiddish operate or influence, how Yiddish is influenced by the German language is dependent on factors that are not just linguistic per se. But again, I'm happy to maybe talk about it in a different setting, because the local context is really basically everything when it comes to these matters. Yeah.
Are there any other questions, comments, remarks over there, the gentleman?
Thank you. So I'm Xavier Richert from France via US, and I'm a very happy tourist here in Vienna. My question is motivated a little bit by historical ignorance. You say in the book that German is a very, very important language in the history of the Jews, and I'm thinking I would like to ask if it was really part of the Zionist program, the one from Herzl that brought the state of Israel to have Hebrew as a official language, or what about since the book of Herzl was written in German, and the German was the most important language of discussion among the Zionists, what about German being the official language of Israel. So how was it historically? That's my question.
Yeah, great. So really good question that also has a very complicated and answer with multiple directions that we won't have time to go into in detail. Herzl specifically was both, he was a German writer, and he wrote in German before he started becoming a Zionist, and he made his career as a playwright and as an author, and he was deeply invested and rooted in the German language. And he at first couldn't care less about the Hebrew language, whether it was as a written or as a living language. He couldn't speak Hebrew, and in his first diary entries reflecting on the language question in the Zionist context, he said, none of us can even buy a train ticket in Hebrew, so it makes no sense to expect that we will become Hebrew speakers. It was more like too utopian, and the guy was quite ambitious in his plans, but actually making Hebrew the language of the Jews was beyond, reality. But that changed, not necessarily because his type of Zionism was radically transformed, but because his Germanocentric perception was challenged by other Zionists, both in his closer circles, but most importantly in Eastern Europe, where his main basically audience had to lie, and where he had to mobilize the audience, and disregarding, or at least even mocking a bit the Hebrew language as a dead language, or as a language that is not practical, was something that was not quite acceptable. And many of the ideological critics of Herzl thought that this was a very dangerous move that would actually hurt the Zionist cause if it did not take up Hebrew culture and the revival of Hebrew language as a vernacular, not just as the holy language, into account and into the center of activity. Herzl himself could not do it, but he did change sort of his approach and started speaking with way more sympathy about the Hebrew language and supporting it. But it will always remain something that is just sort of verbal and not a real cultural program. And in his own Der Judenstaat, in his vision of what the state of the Jews would look like, it would basically be, again, aligned with the imperial order. It will be a multilingual federal arrangement where each people speak the language that they choose, the language that they bring with them from wherever they come. And obviously German would be part of that multilingual order, and it would probably be an important one because it is an important language in the world as a language of science and administration. And that again was something that he wrote as a matter that was taken for granted, and it was only after the First World War and long after Herzl's death that Zionism turned into a far more monolingual approach that said it's Hebrew and all the rest. And that has to do not only with internal divisions within the Zionist movement, but with the fact that this is how national thought operated after the First World War, as centered around the national language and showing fairly little tolerance to other languages operating around them. So this would be the quick answer. Yeah.
I do not see any other hands raised. And that means I will take advantage of the fact that I'm the moderator and I can do whatever I want and ask one last question, Marc, if you don't mind. So you mentioned Hannah Arendt reporting for The New Yorker at the Eichmann Trial, and I would be really interested in hearing just a little bit more on, how the analysis of Eichmann's language actually was tackled by Arendt in her Eichmann in Jerusalem, and how this ties back into your very compelling discussion of the trial.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. I mentioned Hannah Arendt in the talk, and then there's more to say about her importance, because basically it's difficult to write today about the Eichmann trial without thinking about Hannah Arendt's depiction of the trial, because it was so influential and so provocative and so controversial. And the language question mattered significantly in her analysis because, maybe to put it a bit crudely, she believed Eichmann. She thought that what he was saying was a clear reflection of his mind, that his language, the struggle with language and his inability to say something coherent and serious, and his inability to take responsibility for his actions, and his sort of very technical and almost cold-hearted, both ridiculous but also threatening language, is a reflection of the fact that he was ultimately a bureaucrat. He was an epitome of the modern bureaucrat who sees himself as a cog in a system, who basically his entire life and approach to his work and to himself and to society is basically dependent on the confirmation and the validation that he receives from the modern bureaucratic, selfless, faceless apparatus that within it he operates. And in this sense, his evil was more banal because he was not driven by this kind of passionate attempt to kill as many Jews as possible, but actually he just wanted to work well. He wanted to do his job and to do it well. And of course, ideology was an important element in the background, but it cannot explain the level of dedication and commitment that he showed. And the German language, basically, his specific German was just mirrored this technical thinking and his inability to think with any kind of empathy towards other humans, or from a position that is a bit critical or self-conscious of what is the meaning and what is the consequence of what he's doing in different ways. And this is the great danger and the great lesson that we should take from the case of Eichmann, and in order to think about totalitarianism and about modernity and so on. So this is Arendt's take in some general in general terms, but the interesting thing, and that's something that more recent research on Eichmann and also on Arendt shows, that Eichmann was not that naive or that stupid in how he sort of couldn't get his hands around the German language, or couldn't speak properly, or use terms that are not bureaucratic. He actually knew very well what he was doing, and he basically tried to leave an impression that he was just a cog in a system, that he was just following orders, and that that he constantly got lost in his own words and technical terms. And when he was asked to say what he meant in more direct terms, he just couldn't find the words. But actually, he knew very well that if he tried to find the words, it would basically implicate him precisely in these crimes. And recordings of Eichmann speaking in interviews before he was caught, and there are some recordings of interviews he gave to former friends and allies, and different documentation that exists shows that he knew how to speak about what he was doing in a far more straightforward, coherent, clear, mocking way. Where you see his ideological commitment not only to Nazism but also to the destruction of European Jews as a purpose in itself. So in this sense, his German was not a clear reflection on his mind, but it was a strategy. So if you see so you can take the Arendt's take on Eichmann and take it really as a very valuable contribution to understanding how Nazism is more than just ideology or just about evil in some kind of bestial terms. But again, it's not the whole picture, and something of the multiple ways in which the German language operates and how it could be used and perceived by listeners, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. This sort of this continues to be an open-ended realm that requires some kind of attention, not only to the actual language, but also to our own assumptions on what an individual's language reveals about him or herself in the most sincere way. And that's a very, I think, important discussion also for today's discussion of use of language in political culture and propaganda and so on. So I think the Arendt's thesis is very relevant in that context. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm looking forward to deepen the discussion later. And with that, we've come to an end for our lecture today. So thank you, Marc. It was a pleasure to have you here as our Simon Wiesenthal lecturer. Thank you to the audience, and we're looking forward to seeing you again at the next lecture, which is on 2nd of December this year. And have a nice evening. Schönen Abend noch. Dankeschön. Auf Wiedersehen.